It was supposed to be a simple dinner, nothing more, just a quiet evening with family after years of distance and unspoken things. The house smelled like roasted chicken and apple pie, the kind of smell that tries to hide tension under comfort. I had not seen my brother Ethan in nearly 3 years, and now here we were, sitting at the same table, pretending we were still the same people we used to be. Mom had gone all out, cooking everything we loved: mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, even his favorite cornbread. She kept smiling, trying to fill the space between us with small talk, but every smile felt heavy. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands shook slightly when she poured wine. She had been waiting for this night, hoping maybe her two sons could finally speak again. The silence between us was thicker than the air outside. The snow was falling gently outside the window, and the glow of Christmas lights flickered across Ethan's face. He looked older, more distant, harder than like the years had carved something sharp into him. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stayed locked inside, somewhere between pride and pain. Dad's old chair at the end of the table was empty. It had been that way since he passed, and somehow that made the silence louder. Mom finally said, "It is good to have you both home again." I nodded. Ethan just stared at his plate. I tried to smile, said it feels strange being back, but good. He looked up finally, his eyes meeting mine for the first time all night. And there was something in his stare, something that made my stomach twist. Mom kept talking about the past, about childhood stories, about how we used to fight and then laugh minutes later. But I could tell Ethan was barely listening. When she mentioned Dad, I saw his jaw tighten. Mom noticed too and quickly changed the subject, asking about his work. He said it was fine, and then asked me about mine. I said the same, fine. Simple, polite words that meant nothing. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I heard you sold the house." I said, "Yes, I did." He nodded slowly like he already knew, then said, "You did not tell me." I said, "You did not ask." His face hardened. He said, "I guess some things never change." Mom's eyes flicked between us, like she was watching two storms build on the same horizon. I took a deep breath and said, "Ethan, we can talk about this later." He said, "No, we can talk now." Mom whispered, "Please, not tonight." But he ignored her. The air grew heavy again. The clinking of forks stopped. It was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I felt my pulse in my throat. I said, "What do you want to talk about, Ethan?" He leaned back in his chair, eyes cold and distant, and said, "Just tell me when the reunion is." My heart skipped. I said, "What reunion?" He smiled, but it was not kind. It was the kind of smile that hides pain. He said, "The one where you get to explain what really happened that night." I froze. I could feel Mom's hand trembling beside me. She whispered, "Ethan, please, not this." But he kept his eyes on me and said, "Tell them the truth tonight." I stared at him, the room suddenly colder, the sound of the wind outside pressing against the windows. I said, "Ethan, what are you talking about?" He said, "You know exactly what I am talking about. That night when everything fell apart, that night when Dad left and never came back." Mom's hand covered her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes. She whispered, "Ethan, please, stop." But he did not. He just looked at me like I was some stranger he had been waiting years to confront. I tried to breathe, but it felt like the air itself was heavy. I said, "You think it was my fault?" And he said, "I do not think, I know." I stood up, my chairs scraping against the floor, the sound echoing through the house like thunder. I said, "You were not there. You do not know what happened." He said, "I know enough. You called him that night. You said things that drove him away." And Mom sat there crying like the truth had finally escaped. I said, "That is not what happened." But even I could hear the shake in my voice. Ethan said, "You always had a way of making yourself the hero of every story, but you were not that night. You were the reason he left." Mom tried to stand, but her legs trembled. She said, "Both of you stop this right now." But neither of us moved. Years of silence had turned into fire, and there was no way to put it out. I said, "You want the truth? Fine. I called him that night because I found out what he had done, and I thought he deserved to face it." Ethan frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. I said, "He was not the man you thought he was, Ethan. He had another family, another child, and when I told Mom, she broke. He left because he could not face what he had done." Ethan's face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came. I could see his world cracking right there at the table. Mom whispered, "Please, no," but I kept going, because the truth, once it starts, it does not stop. I said, "I kept quiet for years because Mom asked me to. She said you were too young, that you needed to remember him as a good man. But I could not keep lying forever." Ethan looked at Mom, his voice shaking. "Is it true?" She closed her eyes and nodded slowly, tears running down her cheeks. I thought he would explode, but instead he sat back, staring at nothing for what felt like hours. The ticking of the old clock filled the silence, every second heavier than the last. I sat down again, my hands shaking, the food on the table untouched, the warmth gone. Ethan whispered, "You should have told me sooner." I said, "I tried. You never wanted to listen." He said, "You let me hate you for years, for something you did to protect me." I said, "Maybe I deserved it." He looked at me, his eyes softening for the first time since he walked in, and said, "No, you did not deserve it. None of us did." Mom whispered, "I am so sorry, my boys. I am so sorry for all of it." The silence after that was unbearable, the air thick with everything we never said. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered in the corner like they were struggling to stay alive. Mom sat there wiping her tears with the same napkin she had folded so carefully before dinner. Ethan stared at his hands, the anger that had once burned in his eyes now replaced by something else, something hollow. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him I was sorry, but I knew sorry was too small for what years had taken from us. I remembered the night Dad left, the shouting, the door slamming, the sound of Mom crying on the kitchen floor. I was 17, Ethan was barely 13. I held him that night, told him everything would be okay, even when I knew it was a lie. Now, sitting across from him, I realized he had been carrying a version of that night all his life, one where I was the villain. I said quietly, "I did what I thought was right, Ethan." He looked up, eyes red, and said, "Right for who? For him? For you? Because it was never right for me. I lost both of you that night." I said, I know you did, and I have lived with that every day." Mom whispered, "We all lost something that night," her voice breaking like the glass in her hands when she tried to hold too much pain. I took a deep breath and said, "I did not call him to ruin us. I called him because Mom was breaking, because she had found the letters, the ones from the other woman, the ones with pictures of a little girl who looked just like you when you were small." Ethan's face twisted, his jaw tight like the truth was too sharp to swallow. He said, "There was another child?" I nodded. "I met her once after he left. She must be in her 20s now." Ethan stood up, walked to the window, looking out at the snow falling. He said, "I used to wait for him every Christmas. I would sit by the door thinking maybe he would come back, maybe he would say sorry. And now, to know he was just gone, living another life somewhere else, it hurts more than hating you ever did." I said, "I know that pain. I have lived it too." He turned slowly, his eyes softer, his voice low. "Maybe we both deserve peace after all this." I said, "Maybe we do." Mom stood up, weak but determined. She said, "We cannot change the past, but we can stop letting it eat what is left of us." We all stood there in silence as snow kept falling, the house finally still after years of noise. The truth had broken us, but somehow it also freed us. Ethan walked over, and for the first time in years, he hugged me. It was not perfect, not easy, but it was real. And that was enough for now. When Ethan's arms wrapped around me, it felt strange and familiar all at once, like touching a memory that still hurts, but still belongs to you. Mom stood beside us, her hands trembling, but her smile soft, the kind of smile that said, maybe the worst was finally behind us. The snow outside turned heavier, blanketing the world in white silence. The house smelled of cold and forgiveness. I thought maybe for once this dinner would end in peace. But the universe never lets go that easily, because just as we sat back down, the phone rang, its shrill sound slicing through the quiet. Mom reached for it, her face turning pale as she listened. She said nothing for a long time, then whispered, "Yes, thank you," before hanging up. Ethan asked, "Who was it?" Mom's voice broke. "It was the hospital." My heart sank. She said, "It was your father." Ethan froze, his lips parting, but no words came. Mom said, "He passed away."
Tonight in Ohio, heart failure. She sank back into her chair, tears running freely. I felt everything inside me collapse. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He said, "I wanted to hate him forever, but not like this, not without a chance to say anything." I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked at me and said, "Do you think he ever thought of us?" I said, "I do not know, but I like to think he did, maybe more than we will ever understand." Mom whispered, "He called me once last year." I did not answer. I could not. She buried her face in her hands. Ethan whispered, "What if he wanted to make things right?" I said, "Maybe he did, but we cannot change that now. What we can do is forgive him and ourselves." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes distant, lost in the snow outside. Mom said, "The hospital will send the papers tomorrow." I said, "We will take care of it together." Ethan looked at me, then at Mom, and said, "Together sounds right." The word hung in the air like a fragile promise. We sat there in silence again. But this time, it was not anger holding us. It was grief, raw and quiet and necessary. The snow kept falling, covering everything that once felt broken. The lights on the tree flickered again, faint but still burning. Mom whispered, "Maybe Christmas is still about miracles." And I said, "Maybe the miracle is just being here, still standing, still trying." Ethan smiled faintly for the first time in years, and I saw a piece of my brother again. That night, none of us slept. The snow outside had buried the roads, and the world felt quiet, like it was holding its breath. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames, thinking about all the years we lost, all the things we could have said but never did. Ethan sat across from me, the flickering light soft against his face. He said, "I used to dream of Dad coming back, walking through that door, smiling like nothing happened." I said, "I used to dream of that too. But dreams are sometimes just ways to survive." He nodded, his eyes glassy from the reflection of the fire. Mom came in, wrapped in her old robe, holding 3 cups of cocoa. She said, "Your father used to make this for us every winter." We took the cups, and for a while, nobody spoke. It was strange how silence could hurt and heal at the same time. After a while, Ethan said, "Do you think he loved us?" I said, "Yes, but love is not always enough to make someone stay." He said, "Maybe we loved him enough to forgive him." I said, "Maybe we loved him enough to let go." Mom placed her cup down and said, "We have all carried pain for too long. I think he would want us to stop now." Ethan looked at her and said, "I wish I could have told him that I do not hate him anymore." Mom whispered, "He knows. Somehow he knows." Morning came slow and gray, the light falling over the table where everything had changed just hours before. The plates still sat there, untouched, reminders of a night that tore open every secret and still somehow stitched us back together. Ethan stood by the window, watching the snow melt. I joined him and said, "We should go to Ohio for the funeral." He nodded quietly and said, "Together, right?" I said, "Always." We drove 2 days later through the empty highways, the snow melting into rivers along the road. When we reached the small town hospital, the nurse handed us his things: a watch, a wallet, a letter folded inside the wallet. Ethan opened it slowly, the handwriting shaky and faded. He read it aloud. It said, "To my boys, I know I do not deserve forgiveness, but if you find it in your hearts, please take care of your mother. She was always the best of us. I am sorry for every night I was not there. I am sorry for leaving you to grow up without truth or peace. If there is another place beyond this, I hope I can finally be the father I should have been." Ethan's voice cracked as he finished the letter. I felt tears burn behind my eyes. Mom held the paper against her heart, whispering his name. The pain that had lived inside us for so long finally began to fade. It did not disappear, but it softened enough for us to breathe again. As we left the hospital, the sky opened just enough for a ray of sunlight to cut through the gray. Ethan looked up and said, "Maybe that's him." I smiled faintly and said, "Maybe it is." We drove home in silence, the kind of silence that feels like peace. When we reached the house, the Christmas lights were still glowing, faint against the snow, and for the first time in years, I felt warmth again. Sitting at that same table where everything broke, I realized something. Sometimes truth shatters, but sometimes it saves. That night we ate together, not because everything was right, but because we were tired of being broken. From then on, we just tried, and that turned out to be enough.
As strangers, not as broken pieces, but as a family, trying again, and even though the chair at the end of the table was still empty, it no longer felt lonely. It felt forgiven.